Good afternoon. Can you hear me? How's the audio? Great. Hello, I'm Lloyd Sederer. I'm a psychiatrist and a public health doctor, and as this slide will tell you, I am not here on behalf of the DEA, the FBI, the FDA, or the Department of Justice. And I'm here to have us consider looking beyond any particular drug and to look at the forest, to see the forest and not just the tree, in this case, the plant, whether the plant be cannabis, the plant be the poppy, or for that matter, something cooked up in an underground lab. What actually matters with psychoactive drugs? You might think it's the drug, but there's so much more going on, and that's what this talk is about. Who's this? Billie Holiday. So Billie Holiday is, unfortunately, tragically, a really good example of what's called set, the interior, the person that brings to that moment of the drug encounter. Billie was born to a mother who was 19, a prostitute. Her father was 17, nowhere to be found, and she was raised on the streets of Baltimore. When she was 10, she was raped. Her screams brought the local police. They took her to be a prostitute, remanded her, and she spent a year in juvenile prison. After that, she soon after followed her mother, who had moved to a brothel in Harlem, and tried to live with her mother, but her mother threw her out, and by the time she was 14, Billie Holiday was in the sex business herself in New York City. Within a few years, she was arrested, and she was remanded and incarcerated at Shelter Island, a predecessor to Rikers Island. And what was the first thing she wanted to do when she got out of Shelter Island? She wanted to get high. She wanted to get as far away from her interior experience as she possibly could, an experience that was filled with neglect, abuse, rape, incarceration. She first sought out high-proof alcohol and then turned to heroin. She continued to prostitute herself. She tried to make a living in a legal way. She tried to be a dancer. She failed as a dancer, but boy, could she carry a tune. And so was the songstress Billie Holiday born. But she didn't leave behind her dependence on alcohol, and in this case, heroin, and that carried forward for the rest of her life. When she became as well the target of one Harry Anslinger. I don't know if many of you have heard of Harry Anslinger. This was the early 30s. He was the first director of the Bureau of Narcotic Enforcement, which was meant to try to control narcotics, and he wanted to use Billie Holiday as an example. He wanted to punish her. He even had a false planting of drugs on her to arrest her once. He wanted to use her as an example for the rest of the country. And he pursued her in this way, in this cruel way. He had, by the way, been the director of the Bureau of Prohibition. But he lost his job because Prohibition went away, so we didn't learn from that experience in terms of trying to control. And he pursued her for the rest of her life until she died at the age of 44 in a hospital from cirrhosis of the liver. I think it's somewhat of a miracle that those people who don't have that set, that interior that she had, managed to elude a life where drugs play such an important role. That's the interior. If there's an interior, there's an exterior. And that's called setting as a factor that influences the experience of drugs. I have two examples here. The first one, 1971. We were at war in Vietnam, a war that had no favor in this country, and rumors were that combat soldiers, were heavily using heroin, which was accessible, potent, and cheap. The Department of Defense was concerned about what's going on. They were also concerned that these soldiers, upon return from combat, would bring their heroin addiction back to the States, and double the heroin population in the United States. So they asked Norman Zinberg, who was an expert on drugs at Cambridge Hospital, to go to Vietnam and report on the use and predict whether these soldiers would bring back their heroin addiction to the United States. And he found that about 20% of these soldiers were using heroin every day or 3 times a week, this high-potency heroin that they were snorting or smoking. They weren't injecting it, but it didn't, little need for that. This was very high-potency stuff. And he also predicted that that prevalence, that 20% prevalence, would not happen when these soldiers came back to the United States, because the setting that they were in which their life was in danger every day from an enemy they could not tell, in the jungles of Vietnam, with a war that nobody favored, or most of the people did not favor, that was the setting. And one soldier said that he used heroin to make time go away. In fact, about 12% of returning combat soldiers continued to use heroin, and it was less than 20, but not the same as the general population. And we've since learned that, especially from RAND studies in recent years, because that experience of setting changes set. These are not dichotomous, that in fact, when you are exposed to that type of combat, you're likely to develop depression, PTSD, alcohol and substance use. So that helps to explain the 12% setting. Second example of setting. This goes back a little earlier. In the early 60s, LSD became very popular in the counterculture. And emergency rooms in many cities were starting to have regular admits of younger people, counterculture people, coming in with bad trips, adverse reactions, psychotic reactions, and it was upon taking LSD. A few years later, those emergency room visits stopped. Why did they stop? Did the drug change? Did the dosage change? No. The setting changed. Among the counterculture, they learned that, in fact, you have to prepare people for this drug. You have to help them navigate, have a guide with them, have them in a setting that they're not afraid the police are going to crack into and arrest them. And with that, once the setting was changed, the response to LSD became no longer so bad that emergency room visits resulted. Just as an aside, LSD is now having a renaissance, not in the same 100 microgram, 150 microgram dose that used to take on tabs, but 10 micrograms. This is called microdosing of LSD, very popular, some of you may know this, among the creative and financial industries, replacing Adderall. There you go. Some things, when they come around, they come around. Another factor, age. It really makes a difference if somebody smokes the high-potency cannabis that's around now when they're 12, rather than when they're 20 or when they're 30. The brain is under construction. Our brains are under construction well into our 20s, even later for young men than for young women. And when the brain's under construction, it's more vulnerable to substances, more vulnerable to reacting to these substances, particularly some people who may have a history of predisposition to mental disorders. And the brain is being myelinated during this whole period of time. That's what this is a schematic of, and it's that myelin that creates sheaths on the axons, on the nerve fibers, and helps to protect it. Age is a big factor in terms of how people respond, okay or not so okay, to drugs. Potency, another factor. So the indigenous people of the Andes chew coca leaves every day throughout the course of their life. Do they go to wind up in rehab? No. They continue to do this in a measured way, different from when cocaine's potency is vastly increased in a lab. Coca leaves, the substance in that is made into cocaine and snorted. Potency makes a difference, even more potent when you get to crystal meth, crystal crack cocaine, sorry, when you get to crack cocaine. Route of administration. What do you think is the fastest route of administration of a drug to the brain? Most people think it's intravenous. It's not. It's inhalation. Because think about the anatomy of the body. If you inject a substance into a vein, it has to course back to the heart, pass from one side of the heart to the other, and then up to the brain. Whereas the lungs have a direct channel. The brain is really interested in the lungs because that's where oxygen comes from. And if inhalation, something inhaled, will go directly to the lungs, into the vessels of the lungs, and up to the brain. Fastest route of administration. That's why crack cocaine became the epidemic that it did, because of the potency and because of the route of administration. Purity. How many of you have seen Breaking Bad? How many of you have seen it twice? This is a great narrative because it's a narrative, as I watched this, particularly for the second time, that moved from what's called situational ethics. Here was a man who had a disabled son, a wife with little income, a child on the way, high school teacher, and he developed cancer. And his damn insurance company wouldn't cover the treatment that might keep him alive, save his life. So what did he do? He was a chemist, right? He started to cook crystal meth and sell it. This is called situational ethics. It's one of the ways that they brought us into this film because we could empathize with this man who might do something that would otherwise be perceived evil. The second part of the story changes a lot because then he becomes enraptured with his own power. It's no longer situational ethics, it's a power story. But purity, remember from the series, that he and his partner could cook up 99.1% pure meth. And when he tried to retire, and his successor created the same meth, but it was 80% pure rather than 99.1, his customers and the cartel, the customers in the cartel, said, that's not good enough, it's not pure enough, it's not strong enough. So purity is another factor that makes a difference in terms of drugs and in terms of people's encounter with drugs and what happens in the process. The composition of the plant, another factor. So cannabis has about 100 cannabinoids in it. Principal one is THC. That's what gets people high. But then there's a second, pretty common, sometimes 15, 20, 30% of the plant, that's cannabidiol, CBD. And CBD is neuroprotective. And when there's a good mixture of CBD with THC, there are fewer people who then develop adverse reactions, psychotic reactions to the high-potency THC, which is 60 times more potent today than when it was when I was smoking it as much as I could when I was in college and medical school. Really, it wasn't very strong at all. But as a public health doctor, it's really important that the stuff that's being sold in dispensaries have good percentage of CBD. There's even experimentation underway now to see if CBD can be an antipsychotic medication on itself. Composition of the plant. Another factor, the half-life. The half-life is the time it takes for a drug to go from its peak level to half of that peak level. And the more rapid the half-life, the more likely somebody is going to crave it more. If it's a briefer reaction, a briefer response, they're going to want more of it soon. And that you see that progression with coca leaves to cocaine to crack cocaine. And in more general medicine, we saw that with benzodiazepines. That when I started to prescribe benzos many years ago, they were short-acting. Vitamin X in particular was very popular, Xanax. And patients would come back to me and say, you know, I'm breaking through after 3 or 4 hours. It was supposed to have a longer half-life, but it didn't. And that led over time now to much more prescribing of longer-acting benzos like clonazepam. Half-life of a drug makes a difference. It's another factor in terms of what happens with a person and a drug. Addiction is a chronic relapsing brain disease fostered and amplified by psychological and social forces. It's not just the drug. It is about understanding the forest, understanding that addiction is a complex disorder that involves the brain, that involves the mind, that involves the body. And I think that the biggest problem with psychoactive drugs, opioids and other drugs, is that they are so immediately and powerfully effective. That's why people use them, because they work, just like they worked for Billie Holiday and countless other people. They take people away from the psychic pain, the physical pain, or transport them to a place that they may want to dream about. These drugs are very powerfully effective. Efforts to control them, to criminalize them, to shame people, to stop using them, these are fruitless. That we have a lot of solutions, and we're just not using them, and we need to if we're going to do anything to diminish the epidemic of opioids and other drugs that is at our doorstep, all of our doorsteps. So now there's a last and shameless slide. This is a book that I have coming out, which tells a lot of stories, just like the ones you've heard today, and is full of solutions and clinical examples, because we have solutions and we're just not using them. And it comes out in 2 weeks, but those of you who can't possibly wait, you can pick it up at the bookstore. Thanks very much.